ancient world was a brutal place, and for women, it was often even worse. Societies across different civilizations devised cruel and inhumane ways to control, punish, and oppress women, sometimes for reasons that today would seem unthinkable. From horrific public humiliations to gruesome tortures, history is filled with stomach-churning punishments that will make you grateful to live in the modern age. More disturbing is the fact that most of these punishments were specifically designed to intimidate and submit to women. The brutal treatment of women was not merely a case of punishing an individual. It was a message to all others that disobedience, autonomy, or simply being outside the parameters of society would be answered with a terrible price. These punishments were typically done in public, ensuring that the psychological harm radiated beyond the direct victims. Stick with me, because the last one on this list is so disgusting, it might just make your skin crawl. These degrading and brutal punishments are a testament to the lengths to which societies sank in order to control women, shut them up, and maintain rigid, oppressive gender roles. As we learn about these atrocious forms of punishment, it is clear how far we have come and how much farther we have to go. Number 10. The Scold's Bridle, Medieval Europe. If a medieval European woman was charged with being too talkative, gossiping, or simply speaking out of turn, she might end up wearing the Scold's Bridle. The Scold's Bridle was a metal cage-like headpiece that covered a woman's head and a sharp metal bit that was inserted into her mouth to stop her from speaking. The humiliation did not end there. She was typically taken through town in public while jeered and ridiculed by the crowd. The pain was not only physical, but also psychological. The metal bit would often cut into the cheeks and tongue, causing excruciating pain and inhibiting them from eating or speaking normally. Women were occasionally kept in the Scold's Bridle for hours or days. The punishment was intended to frighten and discipline, rendering the women silent and compliant in a society that valued their docility over their voice. Beyond the immediate pain and humiliation, the long-term effects of the Scold's Bridle were disastrous. Women thus punished were turned into social outcasts, their reputations forever damaged. The threat of being forced to wear the device was at times enough to muzzle women, reinforcing the perception that speaking up, especially against men, was dangerous. This punishment illustrated the extent to which society went to keep women subservient and powerless. Number 9. Foot binding, Ancient China. While not really a punishment per se, ancient Chinese foot binding was a sadistic and painful practice that women endured for hundreds of years. Girls were as young as 5 years old who had their feet bound firmly in bandages, breaking their bones and maiming their feet into a small, abnormal form referred to as lotus feet. It was considered a sign of attractiveness and prestige, but in reality, it put women in constant pain, unable to walk. The procedure was painful. Bones were broken and bent back upon themselves, causing infection and sometimes gangrene. Pain notwithstanding, foot binding persisted because small feet were believed to make women more marriageable. For most, avoiding the process meant being shunned by society or unwedded for life, a worse fate than the agony. Even the survivors of the treatment lived a lifetime in pain and social impairment. Not being able to walk normally made women totally dependent on their families or husbands, stripping them of even more autonomy. This was not just about beauty, it was a control mechanism, keeping women physically and socially in line, maintaining their place in a patriarchal world. Number 8. The ducking stool, Medieval Europe and colonial America. Wives who were accused of witchcraft, nagging, or just not behaving like everybody else were often tried on the ducking stool. This was a wooden chair tied to a long beam, onto which the accused was repeatedly submerged in a river or lake. The idea was that if the woman was guilty, she would float. If she was innocent, she would drown. An entirely ridiculous and gruesome way of finding justice. Apart from the risk of drowning, the repeated plunges into cold water led to shock, pneumonia, or death. The mere terror of being plunged repeatedly under the surface of water, struggling to breathe, and facing the jeering crowd observing her torment was mental torture. Even if the woman did survive, the damage to her reputation was permanent. To be accused of committing such a crime would mean she would never be free from suspicion, and therefore it would be almost impossible for her to return to society. The ducking stool was a public spectacle meant to entertain spectators while reinforcing rigid gender roles. Women so punished were often left with lifelong physical and psychological damage. Others were forced out of their homes in shame, while others suffered long-term health repercussions. This cruel practice illustrates how society used humiliation and bodily violence in order to enforce obedience and submission. Number 7. The breast ripper, medieval Europe. One of the most frightening torture devices ever used against women, the breast ripper was exactly what its name suggested: a metal clamp designed to press over a woman's breast and tear it in two. It was usually inflicted on women who were accused of adultery, heresy, or witchcraft. The brutality of this punishment indicated that women who defied expectations would be forever branded, physically and psychologically. The instrument would be heated initially before application, and this increased the severity of the pain. The pain was agonizing, and the wound was typically deadly due to loss of blood or infection. Women tortured this way had little survival chance, and even if they survived, they were left with severe mutilations that ensured them a place as an outcast for the rest of their lives. The gruesome nature of this punishment is why it stood as one of the worst among medieval Europe. It was not just a punishment, but a brutal method of mutilation meant to act as a warning to other women. The mere sight of a woman who had been mutilated by the breast ripper was meant to give shudders to anyone who disobeyed authority. This punishment, as well as most others on this list, was meant to appropriate women's bodies and make sure that they remained in their submissive role compared to men. Number 6. Chastity belts, medieval Europe. Although historians disagree on whether chastity belts were widely used, they were nonetheless a symbol of extreme control over women's bodies. Metal belts were designed to prevent women from having sex, either willingly or unwillingly. Usually locked by a father or husband, the belt would cause painful chafing, infection, and an overall miserable existence for the wearer. Women had little say in when they might remove the belt, and thus minimal hygiene was impossible. This led to extreme medical complications, including sepsis and acute urinary tract infections. The belt was not so much about physical restraint, it was about ownership, the fact that a woman's body was owned by another person. Some women struggled for decades, only to be discarded by their husbands for other complaints, showing their suffering was in vain. Apart from the physical agony, the psychological effect was gruesome. Women who were subjected to chastity belts lost their dignity and independence, being reduced to objects and not regarded as human beings. The practice demonstrated how extreme measures were employed to quell female sexuality and maintain male dominance in medieval society. Number 5. The cucking stool, medieval and early modern Europe. Similar to the ducking stool, the cucking stool was used to punish women who were accused of being scolds, prostitutes, or unruly wives. Unlike the ducking stool, this punishment did not involve water, but instead had the woman bound to a stool and paraded through town while insulted and sometimes even physically assaulted. The punishment was intended to shame women publicly and force obedience. The objective was outright humiliation. The woman would often be left on the stool for hours and hours as villagers spat at her, threw rotten fruits and vegetables, or hurled abusive insults. The longer she stayed, the more dignity was lost. The entire exercise was a public display of humiliation, meant to warn other women about the dangers of crossing the line of what is acceptable behavior. This punishment was particularly cruel in that it created a lasting stigma, ensuring that the victim would be ostracized long after the ordeal was finished. Women subjected to this punishment would often find themselves unable to marry, gain employment, or even walk downtown without facing constant ridicule. The cucking stool was not simply an episode of temporary embarrassment. It was a lifetime of shame and exclusion. Number 4. Stoning to death, ancient Middle East and Asia. Stoning was one of the most brutal punishments that women accused of adultery, disobedience, or rebellion against cultural norms were subjected to. The victim woman was buried up to the waist or chest in the ground, exposing her as a mob of outraged people hurled stones into her body until she died. The very cruelty of such punishment lay in its gradual, agonizing nature. The first stones never killed. They only fractured bones, caused gaping wounds, and produced heart-rending agony. Death may take minutes or hours, depending on the force of the blows. Stoning was not only punishment for a woman, but also a harrowing lesson for other women. Number 3. Forced head shaving. Various cultures. For centuries, women accused of criminal offenses, such as adultery, witchcraft, or even small social crimes, were shaved bald forcibly as a mode of humiliation. Long hair was the symbol of beauty and womanhood in most cultures, and shaving a woman's head was thus a mode of stripping a woman of her identity and self-respect. This was especially common in Nazi-occupied Europe, where women accused of working with enemy forces had their heads shaved in public. The psychological pain was immense. These women were typically jeered at, spat upon, and treated worse than human beings. The pain of losing one's hair was nothing compared to the public shame that went with it. Number 2. The Spanish donkey, Inquisition era, Spain, and Europe. The Spanish donkey was a ghastly torture instrument employed mostly during the Inquisition. The victim, usually a woman suspected of witchcraft or heresy, was made to sit astride a sharp, triangular wooden beam, while weights were hung on her legs. The extreme pressure gradually cut into the body, inflicting terrible pain and, ultimately, irreversible damage. This punishment would go on for hours or even days, with the victims enduring unimaginably. Some did not survive, because the extended suffering resulted in internal injuries and infections. The Spanish donkey was not just about inflicting pain, it was about breaking the human spirit entirely. Number 1. Burning at the stake. Medieval and early modern Europe. Being burned at the stake was most likely the worst and most brutal penalty for women accused of witchcraft, heresy, or vice. They were tied to a wooden stake as they were slowly burned to death, typically before a jeering crowd. The suffering was unbearable. Death was not immediate, and victims some burned alive for minutes before dying in the fire. This horrific spectacle was meant to reinforce religious and social teachings so that no woman would dare question the powers that be. The punishments awarded to women centuries ago were nothing short of horrifying. They were ghastly reminders of how societies had their grip on the lives of women. Thankfully, we are living in a new age, but history is a stark reminder of what unchecked power and cruelty lead to. What was the punishment that shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments.